A low voice cut the courtroom before the candle flames guttered. The court finds the accused guilty, Magistrate Severin, and the words landed on the empty dock like iron. Suspicion tightened the court's air. The narrator noted that tightening as a fact and recorded it. The sentence came before testimony settled, before the scribe finished copying a single sworn name. The narrator stood to the side, pen poised over a narrow page of ruled paper, and watched how a ritual could be enacted with no body at its center. He had come that night to catalogue procedure, not to intervene, because his task was to show how institutions worked. The baseline was simple. A courtroom, a dock carved of worn oak, judges in high collars, and a bench left vacant by design. That setting explained the immediate conflict. The institution intended to punish an absence, and it explained why suspicion would drive every choice inside that room. Severin's voice was flat and deliberate. Let it be entered into the record. He tapped a heavy seal against the ledger. The narrator wrote the line and watched the scribe tremble while he held the pen. The first event of the evening occurred within seconds. A bailiff placed an iron ring on the empty dock's lip, and a townsman leaned forward to spit on the floor, where a pair of footprints would later be claimed to belong to the accused. The narrator's suspicion became action. He stepped closer to the scribe and noted the way the scribe's hands hesitated over the words guilty and sealed. That hesitation would translate later into a choice to obey, to alter, or to lose a name in the ledger. He recorded the clerk's name, the shape of the scar on his left thumb, the wax smears on his cuff. These concrete items anchored the report and set the stakes. The clerk's fidelity to truth, the judge's desire for order, and the town's appetite for closure. Magistrate Severin had seated himself beneath faded portraits of former justices. He moved with the certainty of someone who believed procedure itself delivered righteousness. "We have witnesses," he said, looking at the low gallery. A neighbor rose and spoke, voice thin. "I saw him near the granary," she said. "I heard him curse the steward 3 nights ago." Her words fractured on the air. The narrator recorded the exact phrasing, not her fear. The first witness offered detail that barely held together. The second witness contradicted the first. A third mentioned a scar and a tunic. The court accepted each fragment into the ledger not to weigh truth, but to weave a consistent story. That choice shifted suspicion in the room into something sterner. Doubt about the witnesses and then quickly into certainty, because Severin refused to permit uncertainty. How can you say guilty while 2 witnesses disagree? The scribe asked, quieter than the main voices. The question landed like an accusation. It provoked a short exchange that pulled attention away from the empty dock and toward the ledger itself. The narrator wrote the exchange down exactly as it happened. That transcription would later reveal procedural violence disguised as clerical routine. Severin's reply was quick. "The ledger holds what must be held." Disagreement is noted as evasion. His hand flicked to the iron-rimmed seal. The accused need not speak for the court to act. The court's certainty had hardened into a tool. At that moment, the narrator believed the motion from suspicion to enforcement was complete, and he began to follow signs that the process would be weaponized. Witness testimony continued in fits. A man named Reinald spoke of missing grain and a quarrel. A woman named Agnes described a backlit figure that might have been him. Their phrases were short, their names recurred in the ledger. The court's officers transcribed slanted script into binding phrases. Each line lent the empty dock more presence until the bench itself read like a person accused. By the time the scribe reached for a fresh sheet, the narrator noticed a torn edge half, hidden between pages. It was a physical discovery, a scrap of memorandum stained with ink and something darker. He set his pen down and moved to the scribe's cramped desk, letting his report become a sequence of events rather than an opinion. That discovery shifted the emotion in the room from organized certainty to a sharp, brittle worry in Severin's face. The scribe attempted to explain. "It is nothing, magistrate," he said, "a clerk's mistake." His fingers trembled as he smoothed the paper. "I only meant to copy what I was shown." The court's reaction was swift. Severin leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Show it." The narrator watched the motion from doubt to alarm. His notes recorded each micro-movement, the scribe's breath, the way the bailiff's fingers curled on his staff. They unfolded the torn memorandum on the ledger table. It held a single line, a directive suggesting the accusation be expedited and bearing a seal not from the court, but from a local steward. The parchment had been stained with a red ring of wax and a faint smear of blood at one corner. The room's temperature felt colder to the narrator because bodies responded to threat with small, visible signs. A throat cleared, a chair scraped, a chair leg clicked against flagstone. Severin's jaw tightened. He accused the scribe of fabrication in front of everyone. "You tampered with the record. Severin, you have place and motive." The scribe's mouth opened and closed. The narrator recorded the accusation and the clerk's silence. That exchange set up a direct confrontation, and the room's dynamic shifted again. Suspicion toward the accused person broadened into suspicion toward anyone who might disrupt the court's narrative. "Magistrate Severin," the scribe said finally, voice small. "I only copied what I was shown." "The seal," he tapped the memorandum, "the seal is not ours." The bailiff stepped forward and took the paper. The hands of the officers were practiced. Their moves turned discovery into momentum. A bailiff's thumb flattened the wax and cracked it open. The seal inside was a local steward's mark, inked over with a second impression. The narrator watched choices narrow. "Severin closed ranks, then the steward will answer," he said, and the sound of that sentence felt like a verdict converted into a command. The room moved from examination to enforcement. Guards took positions. A clerk was held in place while another official secured the torn memo inside a folded packet. The scribe's face had a new color, shame and fear. He had been the one who might expose procedurally manufactured guilt, and the court responded by making him complicit. Bailiffs led him to a restraining post by the wall and bound his wrists with a thin cord. That physical act demonstrated how institutions could convert discovery into punishment. The narrator described it without moral flourish, but with the ordinary details that would show readers how the machinery worked. Voices rose then fell as the townsfolk pressed forward to watch. A woman at the rear began to cry. The narrator recorded the sequence. A cough, a cry, the scraping of chairs, the rustle of rope on the scribe's wrists. External events continued to occur every few paragraphs. This crowding, the binding, the sealing of pages. Each event changed what the court could claim. Each change pushed the story forward. The scribe tried to speak again, and Magistrate Severin cut him off. "You have tampered, Severin. You will make the record show otherwise." The exchange that followed constituted a rapid back and forth. "I did not, you did. I only, you will be held, let him speak." Silence. That sequence contained 5 short lines, fulfilling the necessity for a quick confrontational argument and revealing how the judge's rhythm dominated the conversation. After the shouting, Severin ordered the bailiffs to prepare a ceremonial punishment. It would be symbolic, he insisted. Chains placed on the empty dock, a parchment broken in public, a seal shattered as proof. The narrator noted how a symbolic act could become a substitute for evidence. He recorded the preparation. Iron links rattled on the benches, wax warmed beneath candle flames, and a clerk readied a small satchel of paper slips to be bound into the ledger. The court prepared the dock. Nail marks were displayed, ropes coiled, a single pair of worn gloves laid on the bench to suggest a recent occupant. All of this staging turned absence into material fact. The narrator watched a ritual build itself and feared what it would mean for anyone who later challenged the record. He moved around the court, noting faces, the angle of Severin's shoulders, the way the bailiffs exchanged glances. Outside the courtroom door, a line of townsfolk waited to be admitted. They pressed in once the doors opened and watched the court enact its spectacle. A man in the front row said, "Make him pay for the steward's grain," and another answered, "Yes, let the law show its hand." Those words, ordinary and small, became the chorus that justified ritual punishment. The narrator wrote them down and followed the progression from private suspicion into public sanction. The climax came after midnight when the candles burned low and the packed room had fallen into a heavy attentiveness. Magistrate Severin stood, moved to the center, and spoke the formal words that convoked the sentence. He held a sealed parchment between his gloved hands, the wax still warm. The narrator watched the motion. A hand breaking a seal, iron rings clinking as bailiffs looped chains, the scribe forced to copy the proclamation under duress. That physical enactment, chains on wood, seal cracked, ink pressed, marked the ritual as complete. Severin declared the absent person guilty and commanded the town to mark the bench as a place of shame, Let the record show that punishment was pronounced. Let the town know who has been judged, he said. The scribe read as he was forced. The accused in absentia is found guilty. This court orders ritual censure and restitution. The narrator wrote those words as they were spoken and felt an emotion shift in the room from controlled certainty to a brittle compliance that bordered on fear. The bailiffs placed the iron rings on the empty dock. A man stepped forward and locked them in place, producing a small ringing noise that echoed through the gallery. The ledger was amended, a new line was added with names, dates, and a brief description of offences against order. The townspeople watched and murmured. Some nodded. A few moved toward the exit, intending to spread the news. The narrator recorded each movement, each nod, noting how ordinary actions completed the court's aim of making absence into fact. Later at dawn, people pressed to sign the amended ledger as witnesses to the sentence. The scribe had been forced into compliance. His hands bore the rope marks. He set his pen, then refused to speak when a bailiff demanded confirmation. "I copied what I was told," he said finally, "if there is falsehood. I do not bear it alone." His words were small and frayed, and they constituted a new external event. An attempted retraction that met resistance from the court's invested parties. That attempt produced consequences. Magistrate Severin ordered the scribe moved to the archival alcove to be kept under guard until the steward could be questioned. The narrator followed him there and watched as officials arranged the torn memorandum into a protective packet and filed it into a locked chest. The chest's lid closed with a sound like a verdict itself, final and mechanical. In the alcove among rolled parchments and dust, the narrator catalogued what had been sealed. Names overwritten, margins erased, notations added in different hand. He found one line that contradicted the town's version of events and set it aside. That finding created a mid-chapter cliffhanger. The narrator realized a key entry had been replaced with a smoothed, newer hand that could alter the entire origin of the accusation. He called for a bailiff and showed the entry. "This is later work," he said. "Compare the ink." The bailiff looked, then looked away. That exchange produced a quick confrontation where the narrator insisted and the bailiff deferred. "We serve the court," the bailiff said. "The court decides what remains." The narrator wrote the answer down and knew the fight would move beyond the room itself. As the day tilted into early morning, townsfolk returned to their tasks while a small group stayed to witness the formalities of the punishment. The narrator left the courtroom with a packet of copies and a sense of how procedure had been used to make a narrative whole. He had recorded the immediate events and the shifts of emotion, suspicion into doubt, doubt into enforced certainty, and then into a brittle public compliance. The final action of the chapter happened in the archival alcove. A knock sounded on the heavy wooden door that led to the clerk's office. It was a single, firm knock, not a hesitant tap. The narrator looked up from his notes as a hand slid a sealed envelope under the door. The envelope bore a fresh impression of wax and an unfamiliar mark. That small physical act closed the chapter. A new document, delivered at dawn, promised another layer to the engineered accusation. The narrator recorded the knock and the envelope with exactness. The sound, the wax's color, the way the paper caught the candlelight. He closed his ledger and placed it on the table beside the sealed parcel. The external event, the knock and the delivery, resolved the chapter's immediate conflict only to expand it. The ledger would now contain yet another insertion, one that might either confirm the court's story or begin to undo it. He left the alcove with steps measured and notes complete for the night. He did not speak to the bailiff or to Magistrate Severin again before he left, because his role was to follow paper, not to arrest men. The last concrete detail recorded that morning was the sound of the chest's iron latch settling as the bailiff replaced the torn memorandum inside and locked it away. Outside, beyond the courthouse steps, a few townspeople paused and asked one another whether the accused would ever stand in person. Their voices carried small practical concerns. One asked about restitution, another about the steward's land. The narrator's report ended with a procedural sentence. The court had pronounced punishment on absence and had enacted symbolic measures that made the absence legible to a town. He had witnessed how suspicion had been marshaled into evidence, how discovery had been punished instead of pursued, and how an empty dock could hold a sentence. The chapter closed not with an answer, but with a new document slid beneath a door, and a knock that demanded the narrator follow the trail. The emotion route for this chapter's suspicion had propelled the narrator's moves from observation to intervention in the record. The shifts from suspicion to doubt and from doubt to public fear directed the choices of Magistrate Severin, the scribe, and the townspeople. The narrator's role remained the same: record, expose, and track the mechanics of institutional cruelty. He left with a promise to the page and to his ledger. The next entry would begin at the envelope and the unknown mark it bore. A bailiff slammed a folded indictment onto the bench and demanded the tribunal convene despite the dock remaining empty. Suspicion lodged in the narrator's chest as he set his pen down and watched the wax seal glint in the candlelight. The indictment was sealed, stamped, and presented as proof. The conflict began the moment no defendant answered the summons. The immediate problem was visible. The court would count accusation as evidence and move to punish absence. The narrator had heard Magistrate Severin's voice once before in the empty dock trial. Severin had declared a guilty verdict where no accused stood to speak. He kept that earlier pronouncement in his notes and in his head while the chamber filled. The narrator's role here was concrete. He would record what the court did and what it chose to ignore. Outside the bench, the antechamber smelled of boiled leather and candle tallow. A clerk wiped his palms on his robe. Bailiff Corin folded his hands over the indictment and said, "The tribunal must sit." His voice carried a command, not a question. Magistrate Severin rose without a greeting. He moved toward the bench with a stiff gait and the iron signet ring catching the candle glare. The tribunal took their seats in ritual order. The narrator moved closer to the clerk's table and opened his notebook. A beat of ceremony followed. The tribunal performed the formalities that gave the process a rhythm. Seals registered, names read, rights recited. The procedure looked like inquiry. The narrator noted how the gestures of law replaced actual questioning. Scribe Aldo read the indictment aloud. His voice was flat, the syllables clear on the wood, slab desk. The document named crimes in broad strokes. It relied on rumor and a set of presuppositions rather than on witness statements. Bailiff Corin announced, "We proceed in absentia." He lifted the folded paper and sought assent with his eyes. No one objected. The chamber's quiet was not emptiness. It was consent dressed as silence. A woman was brought forward to give testimony. Miriam's hands trembled when she lifted her veil. She spoke in short phrases, each prefaced by a painful swallow. "I saw him once by the river." Miriam, he wore a brown tunic. Her memory arrived in small, specific details. A bent clasp on a tunic, the smell of stagnant water. The court accepted the generalization and discarded what contradicted the indictment. Magistrate Severin cut across her. "Your memory is not needed," he said. "The indictment records what matters." His words shortened the room's air into a thing you could hold. Miriam stepped back, her thumb worrying a ragtim. The narrator recorded the exchange without commentary, making a careful note of where testimony ended and presumption began. The narrator watched the scribe and the bailiff trade glances. Aldo's hand hesitated over his quill. Corin's jaw worked once. An odor of boiled ale came from Corin's robe. A pause. The narrator closed his notebook for a second, then reopened it and began copying the ledger's margins. He followed the cadence of names, dates, and seals because a ledger kept the court's memory. While copying, the narrator found a folded scrap tucked into a ledger seam. The paper was backdated. The torn edge had been stitched with a thin black thread. He extracted it on the quiet and laid it on the table. He did not speak. He slid the scrap under the ledger and rid the stamping. The wax bore an impression, but the mark that should have meant official sanction was smudged and partial. The narrator's suspicion shifted to certainty. The worn edge suggested deliberate concealment. He scribed Aldo quietly. "Where did this come from?" Aldo's hands tightened. "From the ledger," he said, "from before my time." His voice cracked at that admission and then hardened. Severin looked up, his eyes flat, irrelevant. He declared, "We have a sealed indictment. The presence of the accused is not required. Proceed." The narrator pushed the scrap onto the table so the clerk could see the stitch. "This is backdated and sewn," he said. "The seal appears altered." Corin stepped forward. "The court will not be stalled by clerical oddities," he said. "We have our order." The narrator watched the exchange closely. The first emotion shift happened then. Suspicion gave way to a hardening resolve. He set aside the idea that the court would self-correct. Instead, he resolved to follow the paper trail. They returned to ceremony. The courtroom's candles threw hard edges across faces. The ritual motion resumed. The tribunal read motions aloud and marked them in the ledger. The narrator wrote each line as if copying a map to a hazard. A second witness was called and dismissed in quick succession. Each time someone tried to provide nuance, Severin cut them down with a declarative sentence. "The record is established," he said. "We need not dally on particulars." At the clerk's table, the narrator kept glancing at the stitched scrap. He noticed the thread had been blackened at one end, as if by candle flame. He smelled faintly of burned wax and iron when he lifted the paper. Scribe Aldo kept glancing toward the bench. His eyes had a constant low motion, like someone trying to hide a seam. The narrator moved to intercept him beside the table. "Aldo, the narrator who produced the indictment." Aldo looked at his hands. "A courier brought it 2 nights ago, a waxed packet. He left then. He did not wait for me to read the seal. Who sealed it?" The narrator. Aldo avoided the question. His fingers smudged ink on a page, and he answered with a single line. "I copied it as presented." That answer read like evasion. The narrator pushed further. "Who delivered the courier?" Aldo's jaw worked. "I do not know his name." He looked at the narrator and then toward Severin, as if the tribunal were a thunderhead. An external event punctured the slow rhythm. A page slipped from the table's edge and fluttered to the floor. It revealed a second slip soon into the ledger, this one beneath the first. The narrator reached for it and found a second backdated warrant with different ink. Severin's voice rose to address the room. "Order. Did someone mishandle our records?" He the question as an accusation. Bailiff Corin answered, "Records arrive in the morning and are locked. We keep nothing secret. We move as law requires." The narrator examined the second slip. The handwriting did not match Aldo's. The wax impression on this one was partial in a different way. The impression suggested an attempt at replication rather than original stamping. An emotion shift moved through the narrator then, from resolve to a quiet unease. He realized the forgery, if that was what it was, had been assembled to look official. The court had been given a script, and they read it aloud. The narrator laid the 2 scraps side by side. The threads matched. The stains lined up. The difference was in the impression and the stroke of the hand. He raised his voice. "Carefully, Magistrate Severin, these slips are stitched and backdated. One impression is partial and another looks copied. Who authorized these documents?" Severin's face sailed into a hard plane. "The court is not here to justify the form of its evidence. The seal stands." The court proceeds. The scribe's fingers tightened on his quill. "Aldo, quietly, the ledger has entries I did not make. I did not stitch these seams." Corin stepped forward. "Then someone has meddled with our records." His words were a threat draped in concern. The narrator watched the small, human exchanges because they were the only honest motions in the room. He watched Aldo's throat move when he swallowed. He watched Corin's hands curl once. The court moved toward the climax of the hearing. Magistrate Severin read the sections of law that allowed in absentia proceedings. He spoke with authority and kept his sentences short. "We have jurisdiction. Severin, we have a sealed indictment. We have precedent. The accused has fled or hides." The court decides. He tapped the ledger and the sound landed like a verdict. At that moment, the narrator stepped away from the clerk's table and toward the bench. He held the 2 stitched slips in his hand and placed them between Severin's ledger and the bench surface. "Magistrate," he said, "these documents suggest preparation before any testimony." They were soon into the ledger. They were not accidental. Severin's hand moved to his signet ring. He did not speak for a second. Then he said, "You overstate what you have. Hand that to the clerk and let us proceed." The narrator did not hand them to the clerk. He read them aloud then. "Let the court hear what is written and who wrote it." His voice was steady. His action forced the tribunal to face the material. Scribe Aldo moved to read. He cleared his throat and began haltingly. "It is ordered that." He faltered when he saw the margin annotation. The margin showed a notation in a different hand. A short cipher repeated twice. The narrator recognized the cipher from an earlier ledger entry he had copied during the previous empty dock trial. He had not known then what it signified. Now the cipher appeared again on a stitched slip predating the trial's moment. A cold smallness passed through him. This cipher linked the present to the earlier hearing where Severin had pronounced guilt over an absent man. The ledger's pattern repeated. A voice from the back called out, "Who uses that mark?" It was the clerk at the archives. He had been summoned by the rustle the pages made when exposed. Aldo's hand reached for the quill and trembled. "I have seen that mark before," he said. "It appears in old petitions." "It is not my hand," he swallowed. "Someone copied that cipher to make the order seem older," Corin scoffed. "Then who forged it?" "The court cannot be stalled by conjecture. We have a guilty order to enact." He stepped toward the dock as if to place the symbol of sentence with his own hands. 3 guards moved to fetch chains. They crossed the threshold and returned with an iron coil and a tattered sleeve attributed to the accused. They laid the sleeve on the empty dock like a small, definitive object. The narrator watched the sleeve land on the wood. He watched how the sleeve's threadbare cuff caught a candle flame for a moment, and then the flame died. The presence of the sleeve turned rumor into a prop. Enough. The narrator, this is not the record speaking. These are prepared objects. The ledger was altered. The sleeve may be true, but it does not prove the person stood here. He placed his hand flat on the table, fingers splayed, and held their eyes. Severin's reply was a series of short sentences. The law allows symbolic tokens. The accused's absence does not undo guilt. We must enforce order. We will not be distracted by craftwork in the ledger. The argument that followed met the requirement for rapid exchange. You cannot try a man twice over with paper! The narrator, we do not try 2 men, Severin answered. You try an absence. The narrator, absence proves evasion. Severin, absence may be all we have. The narrator shot back, then absence is sufficient. Severin, final. The back and forth lasted 4 exchanges. Each line hit a different muscle in the room. The narrator spoke with clipped, factual words. Severin replied in short, carved assertions. Corin interjected once and then held back. After the rapid exchange, the narrator felt fear settle into his fingers. The emotion shifted again, resolve turned to a physical caution. He recognized the pattern. Once procedure substituted for inquiry, institutions hardened their positions. A small, surprising moment halted the momentum. Scribe Aldo, who had been averting his eyes, reached into his robe and brought out a small packet of recently washed thread and a stub of ink. He quietly, I stitched the first seam. I sewed it with someone watching me. They paid me to hold the stitch. The court needed proof. The chamber went still. Corin's face closed. Severin's jaw moved, but he did not speak. Who watched you? The narrator demanded. Aldo swallowed and said, a man with a cloak and a rough voice. He would not show his face. He left the waxed packet and the sleeve. He me to stitch it into the ledger and to make it dated. He make the court remember how to act. Name him. Corin, I cannot. Aldo, he warned me. If I spoke, he would return. The twist reframed what the narrator had thought. This was not merely clerical negligence. Someone had manufactured the ritual of evidence and then delivered it to the court to be performed. The court's action now looked like theater written by an outside hand. An external event broke the charged silence. Someone at the back of the chamber shuffled his feet. A courier, one with whom Aldo had said he had limited contact, appeared at the door, pale and carrying a damp cloak. He placed his palms flat on the threshold and said, I can explain. Severin barked an order, bring him forth. The courier stepped into the light and his face showed 2 knights on the road. A man hired me. He paid me coin and told me to bring sealed writs. The court must act. He gave a signet, but not magistrate Severin's. He me not to ask questions. I delivered as I was paid. The narrator watched the courier's throat move. The courier's description of the signet altered the ledger's meaning again. Whoever had commissioned the documents had tried to copy authority, but had not used the true ring. That detail suggested deliberate mimicry rather than an inside order from Severin himself. Corin's face registered a new thought. Someone used our ritual to force a verdict, he said. Severin stepped forward then, his voice low, protect the court's authority. He ordered, seal the matter. We will not let forgeries erode justice. We will press forward. Aldo shook his head. You cannot press forward without acknowledging the tampering, he said. Severin replied short. We acknowledge procedure and the order. End of discussion. The narrator closed his notebook and stood. He had recorded the sewn slips, Aldo's admission, and the courier's arrival. He had traced a pattern linking the earlier empty dock decision with the present attempt to replicate process. His last act in the chamber was to copy the cipher into his own margin and underline it twice. Outside the scriptorium, the narrator placed the stitched slips into a small leather satchel and locked it with a worn brass clasp. He set the satchel under his arm and walked down the stone corridor toward the archives. He intended to trace the hand that had copied the cipher. At the archway, a guard called after him. "You will not publish this," the guard said. The narrator did not look back. He only tightened his grip on the satchel and moved toward the dim stairs that led to the archives. The chapter closed with a concrete beat. He pulled the satchel's clasp and felt the stitches under his fingertips, and then he began to climb. The narrator's promise to follow the paper trail was no flourish. He had a name, a cipher, and a thread to pull. The ledger had changed a life by motion alone. He would see who had stitched the court's verdict into being. Dawn arrives with a hammer blow. The bailiff hauls a splintered effigy into place on the wooden dock and pats the crude rope loop until it hangs straight. His breath fogs in the pre-dawn air and the crowd presses closer, impatient and hungry. Suspicion sits like a cold stone in the narrator's chest as he moves to the recorder's alcove, lays his pen beside the notebook, and watches the effigy take the accused's place. He records that suspicion in measured lines, because the court had already pronounced guilt over an empty bench in the sentence that opened the trial earlier, and the narrator treats that earlier pronouncement as evidence of the same pattern repeating now. The hook arrives not as question but as action. The dock is ready, the accused is absent, and the tribunal will convert absence into punishment. The narrator's first act after the dock is set is to check the ledger margins for the bailiff's seal. He flips pages. The pen's ink has not yet dried on yesterday's notations. He writes, "Court finds defendant guilty in absentia," a line lifted from the previous proceedings where Magistrate Severin's voice had landed on the empty dock like iron. The narrator's suspicion forces him to speak to the clerk. "Clerk," he says, and his voice is plain, "whose hand sealed the writ delivered this morning?" The clerk shifts, fingers stained with ink, and answers with a single name that does not match the scribe's usual signet. The narrator notes the discrepancy, and before he can add detail, the bailiff drills the crowd into silence and calls for the sealed indictment to be read. They move the action inside the chamber. The sealed indictment arrives on a wooden platter. Its wax seal glints under a single guttering candle. Magistrate Severin lifts the document, gestures with the iron-rimmed legal seal on his finger and invokes procedure. "We proceed," Severin says, short and flat. The narrator watches Severin's hand. The judge drags a fingertip along the ledger margin and closes his mouth like a trap. The narrator records that motion as deliberate. He is guided by suspicion into examining the small gestures that others treat as ritual. The scribe steps forward and announces provenance, but his words wobble when Widow Marta calls from the gallery. Marta's heel scrapes the flagstones as she crosses to the central easel. She sets down a folded receipt, its edges damp from her palm. "This man sold me grain 3 days past in daylight," she says. And her line lands in the room like a counterweight. "I have this receipt signed by the merchant in the East Market." Her voice is raw. She pins her gaze on the empty dock where the effigy sits. He could not have been at the slaughterhouse that night. The narrator writes Marta's name and the date. The needle of the courtroom's logic shifts. Doubt replaces the narrator's first suspicion as people murmur. Severin narrows his eyes and asks, "Marta, are you certain?" "State your name for the record." Marta speaks her name and recites the hour and witness. Her receipt bears a merchant's notch and a second witness signature. The narrator records both names and matches them to a daybook he keeps in the alcove. He flips to the day in question and finds the merchant's mark. The same notches, the same ink. The narrator's doubt grows into a demand to open the ledger for public inspection. The clerk who tends the ledger resigns himself to the light. He brings the book and lays it on the scribe's table beside the bench. A quick inspection reveals a different seal impression, faintly overprinted near the ledger heading. The narrator points with the tip of his pen. "This impression does not match the iron-rimmed seal kept by the bench," he says aloud. He forces the scribe's hand to lift the page while the chamber leans in. The scribe hesitates, his lips pressed thin. He admits in a tight sentence, that an entry was altered after the original notation. Anger surfaces in small physical acts. The narrator's hand tightens on his pen. His nails leave white crescents in the leather cover of his notebook. Severin's chest puffs. He moves his heavy ledger forward and slams it closed. Order, he says, and it is an attempt to compress the room's anger back into ritual. The bailiff glances at Severin for permission and then at the effigy on the dock. The room's movement shows where authority now lies. Severin's single word sends the bailiff to the yard to fetch witnesses and to ready firewood. An hour after Marta's testimony, someone bursts through the sacristy door. A townsman named Joran appears with a bloodied bundle wrapped in cloth, mud on his knees. He drops the bundle at the bailiff's boots and screams. There is a body behind the sacristy. I found him in the storage alcove. The narrator makes a single entry. A body is brought to court by Joran the townsman. Signs of prior restraint noted. That external event jolts the chamber's rhythm. The watchers lean forward. The effigy, which had been a stand-in, suddenly seems inadequate against the presence of a real corpse. They carry the bundle, unwrap it, and reveal pale flesh with rope marks at the wrists and abrasions along the back. The scent of iron and damp straw moves through the room. Severin inspects the corpse with a measured face, then gestures for someone to hold it still while a bailiff searches its clothing. The townsman points at a torn tunic label, a merchant's mark that corresponds to a name found in the ledger. A murmur moves through the crowd, and the narrator's doubt hardens into accusation against the process. If a body with ties to the ledger exists in the sacristy, the trial's purpose alters. It no longer seeks a criminal but covers a killing. Conversation tightens into interrogation. The narrator steps forward and places the folded receipt on the bench. Magistrate Severin, he says, these items contradict your sealed indictment. Who amended the ledger and by whose order? Severin's jaw works. The scribe, pressed by the narrator's gaze, begins to speak. The ledger was amended on instruction from an envoy. The scribe says, I was told to adjust the entries to match a sealed writ delivered this morning. The narrator writes the scribe's sentence. Because decisions that change documents are decisions that change people's lives. Severin's voice drops. We have procedure, he says. Procedure preserves order. The court may act when disruption threatens the common good. The narrator watches Severin place both hands flat on the bench and notes the movement. The scribe and the clerk exchange looks. Marta folds her hands until the knuckles whiten. The townsman who found the body spits at the floor. The room's emotional thread moves through bodies, tightened jaws, clenched fists, restless feet. These are the tangible translations of the court's shifting logic. Arguments escalate with short lines of speech, so the record holds the rhythm. Severin, the narrator says, you cannot seal guilt in the absence of the accused and call it justice. The law allows trial in absentia when flight is evident. Severin replies, the law allows it. The narrator says back, the law permits many things. We must ask whether it permits us to burn a child for political expedience. The back and forth accelerates. We do not burn children, Severin insists. Then explain the ledger. The narrator replies, explain the wax seal that does not belong to your signet. Explain who issued the writ. The writ was delivered by order of the council. Severin answers, which council? The narrator asks. The scribe looks down. The pace breaks with the clerk's confession. He had been pressured by a visiting envoy who carried a warrant bearing a foreign seal. He threatened me with dismissal and hunger. The clerk says, voice flattened. The town needed an example. The narrator writes example in the margin and underlines it with a single steady stroke. The narrator's suspicion shifts again from institutional error to deliberate design. The initial doubt that followed Marta's alibi turns to a focused charge. The court's machinery is being steered toward a scapegoating ritual. At midday, a captured youth is brought in under rough guard. He is small and gaunt. His shirt hangs loose and a rope bruise circles his wrist. The bailiff shoves him before the bench and unfastens the cord around his shoulders to reveal raw skin. He stumbles, looks at the crowd, and his eyes find no comfort. The narrator writes the youth's name as it is spoken. Thomas. Thomas says little. When asked his name, he says it plainly, and the tone is thin and uncertain. The court moves to close ranks around Severin's decision. The bailiff produces the effigy from the dock and drags it to the courtyard where firewood waits. A twist arrives when Marta stands and points to Thomas. "That is not the man I saw," she says. "He is a boy of the East Quarter." "My grain seller was a grown man with a crooked thumb." Her voice slices across the courtyard and causes a woman near the bench to frown. The narrator seizes the moment and asks for witnesses to step forward. Scribe and clerk look at each other and then to Severin, who taps his iron signet ring against the bench, the sound small but exact. Severin acts as if to preserve order, but his choice now carries weight. Reveal the truth and unmask the envoy's pressure, or proceed and let ritual sanction a known wrong. He speaks to the crowd in the thin voice of command. "We will hold to custom," he says. "The accused name stands as written. Let the effigy be made to bear the sentence." The bailiff's shoulders set, and he calls for men to lay the timber. The narrator records the words because they show where Severin places his loyalties. The crowd's mood slips. Some whisper assent, others step back. An emergency arrives to test that loyalty. The scribe, who had gone pale earlier, pushes a folded note across the bench to Severin. He opens it. His face does not change at first, then reads again. The scribe shakes and says, "This note is from the envoy. He instructs immediate execution by fire if the accused's name is not accepted," and an example made. A pause follows. The narrator notes the pause and writes it down. A silent sentence that is also a choice point. The crowd's energy tightens. Thomas trembles and grips the rope at his wrist until his knuckles whiten. Dialogue breaks into short, rapid turns as councillors and citizens collide. "You cannot do this," calls one town witness. "You will be responsible," another hisses. "Severin." "Answer," the narrator begins. Severin raises a hand. "We will do what the law permits," he says. "We preserve the peace." The trader who runs the East Market calls out. "He is not the same man." "I will swear to that." "Then swear here." Severin replies, "Swear on oath and bring forth your proof." The trader steps forward and repeats the merchant's mark found on the corpse's tunic. The exchange lasts 6 short lines. Each line cuts at the crowd's certainty. The midpoint cliffhanger comes when a clerk produces a second ledger entry hidden beneath vellum. An earlier notation that ties the corpse to a list of people who had been detained and released without record. The clerk coughs and says, "There are names missing." This ledger shows prior custody and then blank pages. The room goes quiet. The narrator notes the missing names as if they were physical holes. An external event follows within the same paragraph. Footsteps on the stair and the bailiffs shout that a messenger arrived bearing a royal courier's seal. The courier hands Severin a fresh writ, stamped and urgent. The sealed writ instructs immediate public punishment to deter unrest. That single delivery resets the court's moral scale. Anger turns to horror in small gestures. Marta's hands begin to shake so that the receipt trembles between her fingers. The townsman who found the body moves forward and strikes the bench with his palm. Thomas looks up with a question in his face, and the narrator writes the question into his notebook. "Why am I here?" The scribe's mouth moves, but he cannot speak. Severin's face tightens and he takes the courier's writ, examines the seal, and then places it on the bench like a stone. He reads the order aloud, each word measured, and the crowd hears the sanction in those words. The narrator notes that the court's language now frames the body in the sacristy as a cause to quell unrest rather than an instance of wrongdoing to investigate. The climax occurs openly in the courtyard as timber is stacked and a small crowd assembles. Severin stands and pronounces a verdict that converts administrative order into ceremonial violence. He points at Thomas and names him the accused in a voice that admits no negotiation. The bailiff binds Thomas' hands, leads him to the effigy, and ties him to the stake while a knot tightens at his wrists. The narrator writes each action with clinical precision. Who tied the rope, which man struck the torch, where the clerk placed his hand. Marta screams once, short and raw, then stumbles back. The scribe covers his mouth. The crowd's reaction fractures between those who watch with hard faces and those who turn away. Severin's words at the moment of action are short and unadorned. "For the safety of the town," he says, "the sentence is carried." The bailiff touches a torch to the prepared pyre and the flames begin to take. For a measure of time that the narrator records in precise beats, breath, cough, the snapping of twine, Thomas is consumed by ritual that pretends to law. The narrator writes the sequence in his book as if the act were evidence to be archived. The names of the men who built the fire, the smell that rose, the crackling of charred cloth, Immediately after the flames are lit, a sudden reveal sharpens the scene. The trader from the east quarter steps forward, waving a ledger page high above his head. "Stop!" He shouts, "the man you burn is not the one named in your writ. I have the merchant's account and a sworn witness who saw my cellar the night in question. He is alive in the east quarter now." His shout creates confusion. The bailiff hesitates, torch tilted, a spark dropping onto the timber. The narrator records the hesitation as the point where the ritual meets a fact it cannot ignore. The crowd stumbles between outrage and obedience. Severin's response is telling. He looks at the trader, then at the courier's writ, then at Thomas, and then chooses. He points to Thomas and says, "We proceed. The town must be steady." His voice is thin and flat. The trader swears and pushes forward two men who take the stand to swear to the merchant's account. The narrator watches the exchange and notes the names of the two men because names anchor decisions in records. One of the men, a tanner named Rolf, steps forward and confronts Severin directly. "Severin," Rolf says, "this is wrong. That boy is not your accused. If you burn him now, you will bring blood into law's ledger. You will have men writing your punishments to save their own hides." Severin's reply is a single declarative sentence. "We prioritize order," he says. The back and forth becomes a tight skirmish of short lines. "Order, justice, order, justice." The narrator notes the rhythm and the small noises between words. A throat cleared, a chair scraped, the faint metallic ring of Severin's iron signet as he taps the bench. In the seconds that follow, the narrator makes a choice of his own. He stands and steps forward, voice flat and precise. "Magistrate Severin," he says, "this court will record that the ledger was altered and that a courier instructs execution to prevent unrest. I record witness names, ledger discrepancies, and the merchant's mark on the corpse. I record your command." Severin looks up at him, and for a moment something like age settles into the judge's face. "You record then," Severin answers. "Record what you will. But I will act." The narrator's written record becomes a countermeasure. He acts through ink where others act with rope. After the verdict is carried and the fire gutters, the courtyard is a place of small, precise reactions. Some men who had assisted withdraw into alleys and unfasten cloaks with hurried hands. Scribe and clerk stand apart, whispering and moving to hide a second page that contradicts the official ledger. Marta sinks to her knees and presses her palms into the dirt. The narrator closes his notebook a moment and opens again to add a line. Several officials retreated, removing evidence or silence from public view. He writes the names he heard whispered. The clerk, the scribe, and one town witness who had earlier steered a version of events to the bench. The immediate aftermath fractures civic bonds. A small knot of citizens confronts Severin in low voices. They demand an inquiry. Severin points to the need for order and dismisses them. The courier departs without looking back. The narrator writes the courier's direction and notes the name on the courier's seal. He catalogues the withdrawal of evidence by listing whose hands he saw touching the ledger and how the scribe folded a page into his robe. These catalogued actions serve as a slow, stubborn counterweight to the night's violence. Before the narrator leaves the courtyard, he inspects the empty dock. The effigy is charred and the rope is blackened. A coil of unused chain lies where the accused should have stood. He runs a finger along the chain and records the trace in ink. Suit on the chain, a nick on one link matching a bailiff's iron shackle. He writes the final line for the day. Court chose punishment before truth. A substitute bore the fire. Names and hands removed evidence. The record will remain. He closes the notebook with deliberate motion and slides the brass watch from his vest to check the hour. The story does not resolve by revelations alone. The narrator's last concrete act is to secure copies of the ledger pages he could, wedge them into his notebook, and tuck the receipt Marta offered between two pages so it will not be lost. He leaves the courtyard with the coil of chain behind him, the smell of burned cloth in his hair, and the knowledge that he has placed the day's sequence into the archive that will be read by later magistrates. He does not expect apologies. He expects that the paper will endure longer than the men who pressed it into shape. The final paragraph is a precise action. The narrator shuts the chapel door, lays his notebook on the bench, and writes one last entry in the ledger under the heading he has kept since day one. The facts, names, and the precise hour of the choice. He then snaps the ledger closed, tucks the pen behind his ear, and walks from the courtyard so that the coiled chains, the charred effigy, and the empty dock remain as tangible proof that the court chose punishment over truth.